A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Why does the rabbi very frequently cite the Rambam? Are there not other codes of Jewish law?
Well, to begin with, those who are familiar with my teachings will know that it is true that I quote frequently from the Rambam, and it's probably fair to say that about 80% of the Halakhic statements that I make, shall we say, and also many of the Hashkafic statements are in line with the Rambam, but not to the exclusion of other opinions. I mentioned many other opinions as well. So I'm not what some people term, or the way some people choose to describe themselves. I'm not a Rambamist in the sense that I know only of the Rambam and I care only about what the Rambam says. That is not true. However, it is very true that the Rambam does have a very special place in the Jewish library, in the Torah library that we have inherited over the generations, because the Rambam was the first, and some would also say the last, but certainly the first and the most successful, I think, in putting down in a systematic fashion the essential elements of the Torah Ba'al Peh, the oral tradition, the halakha, including also all the halachot that cease to be relevant or commonly practiced in the galut reality. All the areas of the Torah are discussed by the Rambam. The Rambam does not, as it were, give in to the reality of the galut. What I mean by this is as follows. If we take, for example, the summation of the halachot pertaining to the night of Pesach, Leila Seder, the first night of Pesach, how one conducts a Seder, what one does, in what order, how one does it, etc. One can find this information A in the Rambam, B in the Rif or the Rosh, C in the Tur, D in the Shulchan Aruch, and in many other books as well. But there is an essential difference between the way the Rambam presents this information and the way essentially everybody else presents the same information. The difference is, apart from the different various opinions on certain halakhic issues which are legitimate and with regards to which I would not always necessarily agree with every point and every opinion of the Rambam, but the Rambam presents this information in a very special way. When you read what the Rambam writes regarding how you run a Seder, the Rambam first introduces you to how a Seder should be run in the normal state of affairs, when things are as they should be, that is to say, when there is a mikdash, there is a temple, there is a korban pesach, there is the sacrifice. Therefore, the whole Seder is a different experience, and there is a different element. There is a new element in the Seder called the Korban Pesach. How do you work this into the Seder? We're not used to doing this, but the Rambam first presents it as if this is the norm, this is how it's done. And then, as an afterthought, the Rambam adds and says, oh, by the way, if you live in a time when there is no Korban Pesach, or such and such does not exist, with regards to other instances of the same phenomenon, the Rambam says, then this is how you go about doing it. In other words, the Rambam first presents to you the Jewish Torah norm, how things are meant to be, how things were intended to be, and the standard galut procedure, which we've all become very used to over many, many centuries, is the way that is treated as an afterthought, as the second best, not the real McCoy, but something else which is an imitation of the real thing. Whereas in every other code of Jewish law, without exception, it is the case that the text refers to the standard Galut procedure, the Galut format of Judaism as the norm, as what we do, and therefore what we are going to discuss in this book. And that which is to be done in a normal situation, where Am Yisrael is living in its land, and has a Mikdash, and has a Korban Pesach, etc., that is not even discussed. Or, if it's discussed in passing, it's mentioned as something that one day in the distant future, things might be a little bit different, but we won't go into that now. Or you may even not receive or learn anything at all about that other real Torah option. And that is a very, very big difference between the Rambam and the other texts. And just to give an example or two of this phenomenon, I'll quote from the Rambam briefly. This is Hilchot Hames U'Masa in the Rambam, Perek Shemini. Rambam writes, Halakhic, he talks about the famous Mishne. He says, the person leading the Seder, or the son, the child, says, Mishne Layla Hazem Kol Halilot, etc., as we know. And after mentioning the dipping and the eating of matzah and not bread, etc., he goes on to say, Shebechol halelot anu ochelim basar soli shaluk u'mevushal. We eat meat which is either roasted or stewed or cooked in some other way. V'halayla hazeh kulos soli. But all the meat that we eat tonight is all roasted over a fire. And then he goes on to mention also the vegetables, that we eat different vegetables on this night, and we place the focus on particular vegetables, etc., as we know. In other words, there is this stanza in the Mishne, which we do not say nowadays because we don't have the Korban, and therefore this would not be a relevant thing to point out. And it is, of course, mentioned in the Mishnah. The Rambam quotes the Mishnah and quotes the original format of these questions in his Mishne Tora. And after having said so in Halakha Bet, he says in Halakha Gimel, Bazman Hazeh, at the present time in the Galuth, this is an afterthought, in this situation of the Galuth, you do not mention the roasted meat, etc. Why? Korban. This difference of focus is not something technical or incidental. It is absolutely essential and fundamental to the Rambam's approach and understanding of Torah Judaism in general. It's like the difference between a person's main field of vision, what he sees before him and what his eyes are focused on, with intent to see and to be aware of what is in front of him, as opposed to peripheral vision, where a person sees something out of the corner of his eye, as we say, where you were not really looking, and therefore you tend not to think about those things in your peripheral vision too much. You don't focus on them, you don't pay too much attention to them, only when absolutely necessary, perhaps. In the same way, when you write about Pesach and you relate to the reality of the Galuth version of Pesach, and that is where your eyes are focused, that is what your book speaks of, and at best it is only your peripheral vision, it is only by the way here and there that it might come up that there is another reality which is in fact the true norm. That is a reality in which the reality of Galut, the fact of the Jewish people living in Galut for so long, has essentially become the norm, and therefore it is on that one's attention is focused, whereas the real reality of Judaism, of Gula mode Judaism, is in one's peripheral vision. Whereas with the Rambam, the opposite is true. The Rambam has square in front of him, right in his line of sight, he has the true, comprehensive, authentic, original intent of the Torah right there, center stage, up front. That is what the Rambam speaks about first, without any hesitation. And then, as an afterthought, that which is normally in other people's center focus, there the Rambam speaks, as an afterthought, he speaks about the peripheral vision. In other words, the galut mode of this mitzvah, or this particular aspect of Judaism. And the Rambam goes on to do exactly the same thing a second time in the same chapter. And I'll read briefly from this as well. The Rambam goes on to say, in Halakha, he says that afterwards, Ahar kach korech masa umaror, you take masa and maror and wrap them up together with some haroset, and you say the bracha shekidushanu b'miswatho usiwanu al achirat masa umrorim, and you eat them. And then he says Ahar kach in Halakha zayin, Ahar kach mevarech, then you say the bracha shekidushanu b'miswatho usiwanu al achirat hazevah, you make the bracha to eat from the zevah, which is a reference to the korban haqiqa, which of course we don't have without a mikdash, and therefore none of us are really familiar with doing this at the Seder at all. And you eat from the haqiqa, وَأَخِلْ مِبَسَارْ حَقِيقَةَ أَرْبَعَ أَسَارْ تَحِلَةً, and then you make another bracha, أَشَرْ كِدُشَانُ مِسْوَثَ وَسِوَانُ عَلَى خِلَاثَ Pesach, the particular mitzvah of eating from the korban Pesach itself, and then you eat from the korban Pesach. So says the Rambam. First thing, that is how a Seder is to be done. That is a normal Jewish Seder. Then the Rambam goes on to say in Halakha Het, Bazaman Hazeh, at this time, when these things do not exist, She'en Sham Korban, Ahar Shemevarech HaMosi Lehamin, etc. After you say the bracha on the Masa, you say another bracha Al Achilat Masa, and you dip the matzah in the haroset and you eat it, and then you say the bracha on the maror and you eat that, etc. In other words, the order and the manner in which you perform these mitzvot is very different, says the Rambam. And this phenomenon appears in the Rambam on a number of occasions. Sometimes it has to do with the presentation of the practical, technical aspects of the performance of this or that mitzvah, and sometimes it has to do with simply a more comprehensive and historically accurate understanding of the reality which we are discussing. And a good example of this is in Hilchot Hanukkah. If one looks in all the other codes and all other books discussing Hanukkah, one finds that the only thing that is discussed is the Nes Pach HaShemen, the fact that a certain quantity of oil lasted longer, burnt longer than was expected. Whereas the Rambam, when speaking about Hanukkah and giving some of the background, he does not only mention that, he does mention that, but he first mentions the fact that the Jewish people were living in their land but were being oppressed by foreign rulers, by the Greco-Syrians, and how the foreign government, the foreign power that ruled their land was persecuting them both spiritually and physically, and appropriating their assets and doing as they wished with their daughters and their wives, etc., etc. The Rambam first paints a true, accurate picture of the Jewish people's predicament and situation in their land, and he goes on to describe how they eventually rose up and fought their oppressors and were successful, etc. And then he mentions how they returned to the Mikdash, to the temple, and everything that we know that continued from that moment onwards. In other words, the Rambam does not focus on the small and essentially unimportant aspect of Hanukkah, that is the miracle of the oil. He focuses on the true message and the true historical reality and importance and significance for the Jewish people's survival from that time until the present day, which Hanukkah represents. So the Rambam, when one learns the Rambam, one becomes used to seeing things from a more wholesome, more comprehensive, more authentic perspective. And this is a very important and invaluable way of orienting oneself correctly in terms of Torah study, in terms of what to focus on and how to view the Torah as a complete system, and not as little bits and pieces of this mitzvah and that mitzvah and this minhag or that minhag. This is also why the Rambam spends very little time in his Halakhic writings discussing minhagim, customs. One may wonder why. Why would the Rambam not discuss customs, almost not at all, whereas most other poskim spend a great deal of time speaking about customs? And I think the reason is, based on what we've just said till now, that the Rambam viewed the reality in which he lived, the time of the Galuth, where there were many Jewish communities scattered all over the globe, and he knew very well that different communities in different countries had different minhagim. He also understood this was a temporary reality, whereas others view this as the reality simply, and it was unclear to anyone when this might end, and it was also not clear to the Rambam when this reality might end. But the Rambam had a vision in which the Jewish people would at some point rise up and leave the Galut and return to Eretz Yisrael, as he writes in Hilchot Melachim or Milhamot Perek Yud Aleph, when he discusses the advent of the Melech HaMashiach, that the Jewish people will return and will establish for themselves a state and a government in Eretz Yisrael, etc., etc. He had this vision that the Jewish people would return to their normative and healthy state of existence. And in that reality, it was clear to the Rambam that all these different minhagim from different parts of the world, different communities, would have to be jettisoned, and a new set of minhagim, one uniform practice for the Jews who have now reconstituted their true existence in Eretz Yisrael, a new set of rules, a revamped halakha, and a rethought set of minhagim would have to be adopted. And therefore, why spend a lot of time discussing something which is destined to be dropped no matter what we do? Let's therefore discuss rather how things should be and how things will be, and that which is at the present time, which is only a fleeting moment in Jewish history, so the Rambam saw things, that we can profitably ignore for the most part. And therefore the Rambam spends very little time speaking about minhagim, and throughout his writings one sees that he is not enamored with minhagim and does not see them as the most essential part of Judaism, which is not the message that one receives from certain other poskim. And it is for this reason, I believe, that Rav Kook who understood these things, on a number of occasions expressed his view that the Rambam would in the future become the central focus, or one of the most important sources of Torah study in future generations. And the Rav Kook recommended that people study Rambam's Mishne Tora on a daily basis, learning one chapter or more or a number of chapters per day, and constantly to review that material, because by so doing one receives a healthy and balanced understanding of what Torah Judaism is all about. And I'll quote very briefly from Rav Kook. In Rav Kook's letters, Igrot Riyah, in the first section on page 155, Daf Kof Nun He, he writes as follows: Kim Dumer, it seems to me, Shera'ui Lithragel Harbe, it is very correct to make a habit of revising the Rambam constantly, Bahazarat HaRambam Kaseder, Perek o Prakim B'chol Yom, one chapter or more every day, Kefi Ha'efshar, as one is able, Pa'am B'lo Noseh Kelim, Mufa'am Im Noseh Kelim, sometimes with some commentaries and sometimes without. Aval Ha'ikar, the main thing is a Hazara Ha'kefith, to go over the whole book, the whole work of the Rambam, Mishne Tora. Shebehemshech ha'inyan, it seems that in the future, Kim Dumeh, She'atid Sefer Hayad, that is to say the Mishne Torah, this work of the Rambam will become Lihiyot HaMa'ayan HaMerkazi LeTalmidei Chachamim, will become the central, literally, font or source of learning and discussion for Talmidei Chachamim. Al pi sidrei halimud shebehechreach yichudshu, and there will at that time also be there will be no option but to revamp and rethink and reformulate the way in which Torah is learned, and the emphasis on what to place emphasis in the curriculum of Talmidei Chachamim in the yeshivot, etc. Rav Kook plainly saw that the Rambam's approach, the Rambam's style, the Rambam's emphasis on certain things and focus on certain things, and his lack of focus on other things, was a system that would be more and more in demand and more relevant and necessary, and in fact crucial for the Jewish people in future times.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.